to this podcast, the Idlecast.
This is from Brett, who says, as a person soon entering his 40s, SIPs now hold on is an encapsulation of how I feel about each of the following.
Ooh, okay. I like this. Okay. I'm intrigued.
Advances in artificial intelligence.
What? Now hold on.
The number of streaming services.
What? Now hold on.
The number of sites I need to create a login and password for.
What? Now hold on.
My 11-year-old wanting a cell phone.
What? Now hold on.
Oh, that one hits home. That one, we're still fighting it. The number of options AT&T was listing off for adding cell phone.
What? Now hold on.
My 6-year-old taking off down the street on her bike.
What? Now hold on.
The price of a small popcorn at the movie theater.
What? Now hold on.
That time we were comparing Anthony Edwards to Michael Jordan.
What? Now hold on.
The opinions expressed in this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or its advertisers. Listener discretion is advised. Ladies and gentlemen, the story you are about to hear is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. And now, Scott Clark.
I know that one day,
The Idlecast.
and I are going to get married on top of a mountain.
Get ready to mumble.
And I am Optimus Prime.
No, I'm not. But it's the Idlecast, the podcast devoted to recovering Reformed theology, piety, and practice.
We talking about practice. Not a game. We talking about practice.
I'm a pastor and a church historian. This episode is for the week beginning Sunday, September 1, 2024. We're brought to you by the Heidelberg Reformation Association. We exist to recover the Reformed confession and to help others discover it. We're at heidelbergreformationassociation.org. Email or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net.
Don't leave your name and message. I'll get back to you.
Call or text the Idle phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. And don't forget to subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Give us a 5-star rating in your app so that others can find the Heidelcast.
Guess what? I got a fever, and the only prescription is more cowbell.
Oh, thank you for the cowbell. We really need more cowbell.
So you want to start reading the Puritans, but you're not sure where to start. Puritan Treasures for Today from Reformation Heritage Books is a series that makes the riches of these godly writers accessible for you. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from writers such as John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and many others are the perfect entry point into the Puritans. I just reviewed David Clarkson's Prizing Public Worship, and it's a marvelous volume in the series. These works are accessible, clear, and edifying. Check out Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagerbooks.org/Puritan Treasures. When you order, be sure to use the coupon code HEIDLCAST, that's HEIDELCAST, for a 10% discount on your total purchase. That's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures, and for the coupon code HEIDLCAST for a 10% discount on your total purchase. This is part 2 of our series,
The Comfort of the Covenant.
We've compiled a resource page at heidelblog.net/comfort. And it has a list of Heidelblog resources. It has a bibliography. And of course, most importantly, it has all the episodes for the series. And it's linked in the show notes of each of the shows in the series. As always, you can find everything you need at now heidelcast.org. Again, everything that you need is at heidelcast.org. The Heidelcast. This episode is devoted to answering the question, and maybe the next episode too, because I'm looking at my notes here. There are 43 pages, so it's double spaced. Some of it's outlined. So I don't know. Sometimes I can skip through things that might not be that interesting to you. But this, I don't know that there is a lot of fat in these notes. So maybe this will be 2 episodes. And maybe it should be 2 episodes to answer this question. Why does good covenant theology matter? So what? is a question I frequently get from my seminary students. Why should we care about this? And the answer to that is complicated. Some of it is because I told you it's important, and I'm here to teach you. And there are things that I think you need to know, and I wouldn't be telling you if I didn't think it was significant. My mother used to say, "Do you think I'm talking just to hear my gums flap?" And that was a question that was not safely answered one way.
Is everybody done?
You could find yourself in an uncomfortable position in my house as a kid if you didn't answer that question very carefully. No, ma'am. I'm sure that what you're saying is very important, and I'm deeply interested in it. Was the correct answer to that question. So, no, there are a lot of reasons why this is important. One of them is because, believe it or not, and you maybe haven't thought of it this way, I don't think I have always thought of it this way, but I do now, which is one of the reasons why I'm telling you this. Everyone has a covenant theology. You might think, well, that guy has a covenant theology, but that guy is dispensational, or this guy is covenantal and that guy isn't. There are people, like evangelicals, and particularly dispensationalists, who are rabidly opposed to covenant theology. But I contend, in fact, they have a covenant theology. It's just not a very good one. Is my answer. If you want to know more about what we have on the Heidel blog and the Heidelcast about dispensationalism, if you're thinking through it and thinking, I don't know if I find this very satisfactory, I want to look into some alternatives, take a look at heidelblog.net/dispensationalism. And there you'll find lots of resources. Just check to make sure that worked and all the stuff is there. And it is. And that'd be a good place to start. Right, not a be-all and end-all, but it will get you started. So everyone has a covenant theology. Somebody says, I just follow the Bible. That's a covenant theology. It's a covenant theology that's likely to lead you to Socinianism. That's called Biblicism. I've seen some notable people lately defending Biblicism, and they plainly just don't know what it is. There's no need to defend Biblicism. There's a distinction between being biblical and biblicistic, or being a biblicist, or Biblicism, practicing Biblicism. So Biblicism is, I'm just going to read the Bible, and I'm not going to pay any attention to how the church has read the Bible. I'm not going to, learn from anybody else about the Bible. I'm not going to discuss my understanding of Scripture with anybody else. Just I and my Bible in the closet, and whatever I discover by myself in splendid isolation, that's what the Bible must teach. Of course, that's not reformational. It's not what Luther did. It's not what any of the Protestants did. They engaged the whole history of the church. They were ecumenical Christians, for one thing. They believed the ecumenical creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, the definition of Chalcedon. They were well-read in the history of the church and the history of theology, the history of interpretation, had studied it thoroughly. Luther did it as a student. Calvin didn't study it as an academic subject exactly, although he read on his own and continued to learn all through his life. So he didn't have formal theological training, but he became quite well read as he could, with all the demands of ministry on him in the history of theology. And his Orthodox successors certainly became very well read in the history of the church, the history of theology, the history of interpretation, and so forth. But the Socinians were a group that arose in the late 16th century and developed through the 17th century and eventually became Unitarians. And they said, we're prepared to believe what is reasonable. So they put human reason above Scripture, but they professed to only follow the Bible. That was the trick they played. They said, we just follow the Bible. And you people are all beholden to all these extra biblical ideas, which, of course, the church said, well, we've developed that from reading the Bible. But the Socinians said, well, we're just going to read the Bible as if nobody's ever read it before. And some of them, if you ask them a question, or they would do it, one of them in England, John Biddle, did a catechism where he would ask a question, and then he would answer the question by giving you Bible references. He wouldn't even quote the passage or let alone explain it. He would just give you Bible references. John Owen spent a better part of a volume responding to Biddle's catechism. And as I say, these Socinians denied the atonement, the substitutionary atonement, that Christ died in our place. They denied the Trinity. They denied the two natures of Christ. So they eventually became Unitarians, is what they did. And they did it all the while saying we're just following the Bible. Socinianism is a very bad way to go, but that is where Biblicism leads. So you don't want to be a biblicist, and you should ignore those people, even if they're well-known evangelicals defending Biblicism, because they just don't know what they're talking about. That's the history of the movement, Biblicism. So I just follow the Bible, though that's a covenant theology. Those people develop a view of the history of redemption, and that's all covenant theology is an explanation of the history of redemption. You could add to it to be a little more sophisticated. It also entails an explanation of the relationship between heaven and earth. That's important. If you want to know more about that, you can read Gerhardus Voss, Biblical Theology, and the rest of his works. Those are wonderful. You could read our dear friend Harrison Perkins. He's an HRA board member. You could read his new book on covenant theology. A lot of good books on that. John Fesco has a book on the relationship between eschatology and redemptive history. So lots of good resources out there. But in the essence of covenant theology, it's an explanation of how redemptive history works.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
So anybody who proposes an explanation for the history of redemption is proposing a covenant theology. That means that, as I indicated earlier, dispensationalism is a covenant theology. The earlier versions was a very complicated covenant theology. That will shock dispensationalists to hear that. What do you mean? The word dispensation is a word that the Reformed often used because it is a synonym for the word administration. Well, administration of what? Administration of the relationship, to put it in neutral terms, between God and Adam before the fall. And we call that a covenant of works, or a covenant of nature, or a covenant of life. That's a term that we use, dispensation or administration. There's a Noahic covenant. So if you call it a Noahic dispensation, you're just saying the Noahic administration of what? Of the covenant that God made with Noah. Or covenants, I'd say there's two. There's a redemptive covenant in chapter 6, and then there's what's been called the common grace covenant in chapter 9. I think those are distinct things. People haven't always agreed on that. The Abrahamic dispensation is what? The administration of the covenant that God made with Abraham. The Mosaic dispensation is what? An administration of the covenant that God made with Moses, and then eventually David, and so forth. So it's a covenant theology. It's not a very good covenant theology for the reasons that I will explain in this episode and in the next. Someone says, I'm a Baptist. That's a covenant theology. You're committed as a Baptist to saying that there is a fundamental difference between the types and shadows, not just a difference in administration, but a fundamental difference. Now, there are multiple Baptist covenant theologies. You're certainly committed to denying the proposition that there's one covenant of grace, multiple administrations. Baptists reject that, and that's essential to Reformed covenant theology. Lutherans have implicitly a covenant theology, and in a lot of ways, it's not really very different from historic Reformed covenant theology. They don't talk that way most of the time. Occasionally you'll find a Lutheran biblical theologian talking that way. I remember being at a conference where a Lutheran got up and did a paper on the Lutheran covenant theology, and I thought, well, that sounds very familiar. And the little that I know about the covenant theology among the Lutheran Orthodox in the 17th century, they were working with categories that I think in some ways they had borrowed from the Reformed that were very familiar to us. And of course, we had borrowed a lot of our covenant theology from the kinds of things that you see in Luther's For example, Luther's lectures on Genesis from the 1530s. So there's a lot of interplay between those two traditions. We basically read them in very similar ways. Lutherans tend not to like the idea of a covenant of works before the fall, but in my experience, it's because they don't understand it very well. They find the very title repellent, I think, and don't always grasp that we're talking about man in a state of righteousness and true holiness. And you have to make that very clear distinction between a covenant of works before the fall and a covenant of works after the fall. We'll come back and talk about that. So there's no Christian who doesn't have a covenant theology. And so you'll either have a good biblical covenant theology or a bad covenant theology. Suddenly, I feel like I'm on the set of The Wizard of Oz.
So what the Munchkins want to know is, are you a good witch or a bad witch?
So how do you know what is a good biblical theology or a good covenant theology and what is not? Well, first of all, is it biblical? Is it driven by the biblical story or is it driven by something else? And one of the reasons I was never really a very good dispensationalist, but I think when I became a Christian in that sort of Baptistic, evangelical, quasi-dispensational context, we were all dispensationalists to one degree or another. That was the only really explanation of the history of redemption with which I was familiar until I ran into Reformed theology. As I looked at these issues, when I first started studying Reformed theology and comparing dispensationalism with Reformed theology, I decided that dispensationalism is driven by an attempt to correlate the Bible to the newspaper. I think there's more to it than that, but that was what I thought early on, and because that's what I saw both in print and in the sort of popular appropriation, that it wasn't really driven by Scripture. My dispensational friends and the dispensational writers that I was reading, they weren't really very familiar, it seemed to me, with the Old Testament, and that they didn't really understand the Old Testament the way that the New Testament did. I remember being struck by that. J. Dwight Pentecost, Things to Come. I have the book. Actually, I had it. I got rid of it, sold it, gave it away, whatever. Then I saw another copy. And because I'm always, referring to this episode, I thought, well, I better have a copy so I can check and make sure that my memory is right. And anyway, very early on, I don't have it in the studio with me right now, but very early on in the book, in the teens, as I recall. But this memory goes back beyond 40 years. But I remember reading this and Pentecost saying that we can't read the Bible the way the disciples did. That's crazy. That's not possible. So I remember Pentecost saying that the Pharisees basically got it right, that they had the right way of reading the Bible. They just reached the wrong conclusions. And my immediate reaction, that has not changed in all these years since, is to say, no, that's exactly wrong. Jesus was very unhappy with the way the Pharisees read the Bible, not just their conclusions, but their method. And so that's one of the differences between Reformed theology and dispensationalism, is that we are committed to reading the Old Testament, that is the Hebrew and Aramaic scriptures. So all of it from Genesis to Malachi, not just the Mosaic section, if you will, which strictly speaking is the Old Covenant. But speaking of all of it, we're going to read it all the way that the New Testament does. And we think that we can do it. We think we're supposed to do it. We think Jesus teaches us to do it and how to do it. We think the apostles teach us to do it and how to do it, and that's a superior way of reading the Bible. Secondly, it has to be Christian. That is, it has to be consistent with the ecumenical creeds. And then I would add to that the broader Christian tradition. And here's again a contrast between Reformed theology and dispensationalism. If you were to propose dispensationalism, any one of them really, but particularly the earlier forms, to any period of the history of the church before the 19th century, they would have said, I'm sorry, that's incompatible with the historic Christian way of reading the Bible. And I know that because this is the stuff that I study and teach professionally. You just don't find dispensationalism before dispensationalism. It's a novelty in the history of the church. So I tell my students when they come in for ancient church their first church history class, that you have to make a decision whether you will be historic Christians or dispensationalists, because you can't be both. It's possible that everyone is wrong about the history of redemption and that Israel, national Israel, is really in the center of the story, but that is certainly not the way that the church has read the Bible in the history of the whole great broad Christian tradition. That would be the second mark. So consistent with the ecumenical creeds and broadly with the great Christian tradition, and dispensationalism fails that test. By the way, the Baptist view also fails that test. You just don't find people making Baptist arguments exactly. You can find some analogies, and in the 16th century, the Reformed, for example, would say, and did say some of them. Daniel Featley, for example, said this in the 17th century, but I don't think he was the first. I don't know who the first was, but I think he represents a stream of thought that when the church rejected the Donatists, Donatists, in the 4th and 5th centuries, that they were rejecting, in effect, a Baptist reading of redemptive history. There are certain connections between the Donatists and the Baptists, but I don't know that the Donatists actually were Baptists. I don't accept that as an established fact. So the Baptist view is a novel view, and it doesn't really appear in any coherent way, certainly, until the Anabaptists in the early 16th century. So that's highly problematic. One of the interesting things that I've been watching is Baptist scholars reconnecting with and talking about and working on the great Christian tradition. And I keep thinking, okay, this is great, but how are you going to connect yourself to that great Christian tradition? And I can see them working at it and trying, but I think they're going to have eventually some kind of a crisis, because you just can't do it, really. There are some very deep inconsistencies between the Baptist reading of redemptive history and that of the great Christian tradition. So and it'll be interesting to see how that works its way out. And then as a Reformed guy, as a Reformation guy, I would say a good covenant theology is that which is consistent with the Reformation solas. And that certainly, again, raises problems with at least some forms of dispensationalism. I don't think with all forms. And so if we think of three of them: original dispensationalism, modified dispensationalism, and progressive dispensationalism, I think I don't see that with progressive, and I see some inconsistency sometimes with the modified, some modified versions, depending on whether you're looking at, maybe a Ryrie, which is who I think of as sort of, modified dispensationalism, and then MacArthur, where do we slot him? Somewhere between the modified and the progressive, leaky dispensationalism? I don't know. Not sure. But there are inconsistencies with the way that MacArthur speaks, as I've documented in that long series going chapter by chapter, page by page, verse by verse, if you will, through his volume, The Gospel According to Jesus. If you want to read that, if you're not aware of that, if you want to hear it, you can do that too. Just go to heidelblog.net/GAJ.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
So there have been different kinds of covenant theology. Some have been helpful and edifying, and some not. So among the more helpful versions that sort of guided us and set the baseline for historic Christian reading of redemptive history, I look at Barnabas, for example, very early on, probably about AD 120. And Barnabas sees Christ all through the Old Testament. He has whole chapters where he goes through and says, well, this points to Christ and that points to Christ and this is a type. And in fact, he even gets a little carried away and he moves from typology to allegory. But at that point, we want to say, well, that's maybe not very helpful, brother, but what we see him doing is pointing people to Christ at the center of redemptive history. And that's very important. That's a big point, or really the heart of Reformed covenant theology. And we're with Barnabas. So if you sit down and read Barnabas, you'll say, well, there's some weird stuff here, but it's on the whole very edifying and very, very early. You see the same thing in Irenaeus, in the later 2nd century, AD 170s or 180s. And Irenaeus is very Christ-centered in his reading of redemptive history. Certainly neither one of them, Barnabas or Irenaeus, and there are others we could point to. I'm thinking of Justin Martyr, in between the two, and he does the same kind of covenant theology. You can look at Clement of Alexandria, who's basically ripping off Barnabas. But again, there's a consistent pattern in the early Christian church in the 2nd century of seeing Christ at the center of redemptive history and seeing essentially one covenant of grace. We would say they would simply say one covenant, one diatheke, is the word that they're using in Greek. And it's a New Testament word for covenant, multiple administrations, all pointing to Christ, all pointing to him at the center of redemptive history. That was the plan all along. And so there's a real pattern there. And none of them are dispensational, and you don't find anybody that I'm aware of doing dispensational theology, for example, or, as I say, Baptist theology. Another good example, and this is why we're doing Olivianus in this series, is that he's a great example of the Reformation appropriation of the great Christian tradition and trying to, if you will, move the ball down the field a little bit, advance covenant theology, and working out a covenantal explanation of the history of redemption. So he's right there when Ursinus is beginning to develop what becomes the covenant of works before the fall. So just so you know, there are 3 covenants broadly in the history of redemption that we see reflected in the history of redemption. The first is the covenant of redemption between the Father and the Son from all eternity. So this is pre-historical, pre-temporal, from all eternity, what the Reformed began to see actually very early in the history of Reformed theology, as early as the early 1520s, indications that there was a covenant between the Father and the Son. And that was originally called the Concilium Pacis, the Council of Peace. Later it came to be called the Covenant of Redemption, or the Pactum Salutis, the Covenant of Redemption, in which the Father gave a people to the Son, and the Son said, I will be the representative of that people. I will be the redeemer of that people. I will be the surety of that people. That's a key term that you see in the book of Hebrews. Surety, the guarantee of that people. I will meet the terms of this covenant. It was for him a covenant of works, and for us it is a covenant of grace. God has graciously given us to him, and he has graciously, the Son, graciously agreed to be our representative, to be our surety, and to earn and guarantee our redemption, and at the end of redemptive history, to give us back, as it were, to the Father. So that's the pre-temporal covenant, and that gets manifested in 2 historical covenants, if you will. And the first is, as I say, this covenant of works between God and Adam, in which God implicitly made a covenant. The word covenant isn't there, but the stuff is there. And the covenant is, if you will love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself, and pass this test that I'm going to impose upon you, you will enter into eternal blessedness. And everybody, all of humanity, is in you, Olivianus says, both biologically and legally, so that he's our federal head, the first federal head, the representative head. That's all federal means, of all humanity. And had he obeyed, he would have entered into eternal blessedness, and we in him. And he failed, of course, as you know, the day you eat thereof, you shall surely die. That was the command representing, summarizing the whole moral law. Love God with all your faculties. Love your neighbor as yourself. And as Jesus said, our Lord said, Matthew 22, 37 through 40, and boiling down the 10 commandments. And as I say, Adam transgressed. He violated the commandment of life, as we say in the Belgic Confession. He broke the covenant of works, as we said in the Westminster Confession, chapter 7, and plunged us all into death and judgment and condemnation. And then there is a covenant of grace that's also reflected from the pretemporal covenant, the Pactum Salutis. As I say, it's a covenant of works for the Son. He has to meet these terms. He has to obey. But for us, it is a covenant of grace. And so that gets reflected in the history of salvation. God comes to Adam and Eve after the fall and makes a promise. He will send the seed of the woman who will do battle with the seed of the serpent. And the serpent will strike his heel, and the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And we understand that to be a promise of the coming of Christ, God the Son, will become incarnate, and he will do battle. And we see that played out in the Gospels. I once heard a dispensational pastor friend, say in a worship service that the problem with the Gospels is that the Gospel is not in the Gospels. So I presume he learned in a dispensational seminary. And that's just flatly wrong. The whole church rises up and says, no, that's crazy. The good news is definitely in the Gospels. The law is present in the Gospels, that's sure, but the Gospel is also present. And we see it played out in the desert, the seed of the woman versus the serpent. And finally, all the way to the cross, when we do see the serpent striking his heel. But we also see the seed of the woman, Christ, God the Son incarnate, crushing his head. And so that's a good covenant theology that reads the Bible that way. And Olivianus is right there as we're working all of that out. And we'll see that. Nobody's talking quite yet about a pactum salutis, for example, but it is certainly, in my view, present in Olivianus. So when we get to looking at firm foundation, you'll see that very early on, and basically the first question and answer, he turns to what we later came to call the covenant of redemption. But he certainly also has a covenant before the fall. He doesn't have an elaborate doctrine of a pre-fall or pre-lapsarian covenant, but it's there. And a lot of his focus is on the outworking of the covenant of grace, the historical unfolding, the redemptive historical unfolding of the story of salvation through various administrations of the covenant of grace. And that's why he published a book in 1585, the title of which I mentioned last time is On the Substance of the Covenant of Grace Between God and the Elect. And that's because the substance is what makes a thing what it is. What's the substance? Well, Christ and his benefits. That's the substance. But if there's a substance, there's also accidents, to use the traditional Aristotelian categories. Accidents are those things that are present that are not of the essence. For example, I'm looking here at a computer, and it's a laptop computer, notebook computer. And it's sort of, I don't know what color it is exactly, grayish, black, I'm not sure. It's pretty, but it could be red, it could be blue, it could be green, and it could be white, it could be translucent. It really doesn't matter, right? The color is accidental. It's not of the essence. What's of the essence of that computer are the chips, the motherboard and other processing chips that without which there's no computer. You can even strip off, as I saw done one time at a repair shop, you can strip out the keyboard that's sort of laid in there. And so the guy take that out like a surgeon. It was actually a little disturbing to watch. And anyway, he fixed it. Everything was fine. But I realized, well, the keyboard's not even essential, I guess. But the chips are. They are of the substance of the computer. So the substance is what makes a thing what it is. And the accidents are things that could be other than they are. And that's what Olivianus is saying, that there's one substance of the covenant of grace, always has been from the very beginning, and it's had various administrations. And so there was a Adamic administration after the fall of the covenant of grace. There was a Noahic administration. There was an Abrahamic administration, Mosaic administration, Davidic, and you could even, if you wanted to press it, say prophetic or exilic or whatever you want to say. So multiple administrations of the one covenant of grace. And Olivianus always points us to Christ as the center of redemptive history.
This is the voice to say, I finally got around to looking at the ratings on Apple Podcast, and it turns out people like the Heidelcast.
Truth is stranger than fiction.
Let's get Mikey. Yeah. He won't eat it. He hates everything. He likes it. Hey, Mikey.
Calvin Knox says, home run, Dr. Clark. Give me news. Go Big Red says, Scott is the Tommy Frazier of the airwaves. Don't miss an episode. TB Tesh says, guess what? I got a fever. And the only prescription is more Heidelcast. Thankful for Dr. Clark and this podcast that is both edifying, informative, and fun, which is no easy feat. Kathy LBC says, informative, learning a lot from this podcast, but I will say that I am not a fan of the creepy voice that randomly says Heidelcast and speaks like he's in witness protection. Ha ha. Other than that, it's great. Creepy.
I'm your huckleberry.
Is everybody dumb? I'm a victim of circumstance.
Thanks a lot, Kathy. I was in witness protection. I guess I'm not anymore. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. And don't forget, you can also mail a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
As I suggested earlier, there have been some versions of covenant theology that were not very helpful. And we could look at a whole bunch. We could do a whole series of that, I suppose. But briefly, quickly, just to say, for example, in the 14th century, partly in response to Thomas Aquinas, the Franciscans, which is a competing monastic order and to some degree a competing theological movement in the late medieval church, developed a covenant theology in the 14th and 15th centuries that said, in effect, by nature, you're not sinful at all. And God has endowed everybody with sufficient ability, if they will, and whoever capitalizes on that ability, whoever does their best, God will acknowledge that, graciously acknowledge that, and credit that as righteousness. And that there was a Latin phrase for that. I make my students memorize this phrase, and some of them can repeat it to me years back, and some of them even can explain it. The phrase is facientibus quod in se est Deus non denegat gratiam. To those who do what lies within them, God denies not his favor or his grace. And what's inside everyone is that with which everyone has been endowed. And there are some who capitalize on that and some who don't. And that's come to be known as the Franciscan covenant theology, or the Franciscan pactum, which is the word that they used to describe this. God had made this covenant with all humanity. And that's a terrible covenant theology, but it keeps coming back. It came back in the Arminians. Arminius, basically, Jacob Arminius, essentially repeated this. He set up a system whereby all humans have been endowed with sufficient ability to do what needs to be done. And if they do it, God will recognize that. In fact, that's really of the essence of what he did. That was the revolution that he tried to bring about in Reformed theology. In Arminius' theology and in the theology of the Remonstrants, God hasn't elected persons. He's elected conditions, and whoever meets the conditions is, in that sense, elect. Well, we see that in the federal vision. They're doing the very same thing. God hasn't actually elected persons. He's elected conditions. If you meet the conditions, then you're one of the elect, so long as you continue to meet the conditions. And, dispensationalism, as I've already tried to explain briefly, is a bad covenant theology. For example, where Hebrews 3 says clearly that Moses worked for Jesus, dispensationalism reverses that relationship. Let me read for you a little bit from Hebrews 3, beginning in verse 1. This is from the English Standard Version. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses was also faithful in all God's house. So there's a comparison there. Now there's about to be a contrast. Because Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. So that's a contrast. As much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now, Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But, verse 6, Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. In the ancient world, the son is heir and an owner. Well, Moses is a worker in God's house. Well, what is God's house? It's the church. It's the history of redemption. So Moses is an honored household servant. But Christ is the son. He's the heir. He's the owner. And in this analogy, the Father, I guess, is the builder. And we are his house, if indeed we hold fast our confidence and our boasting in our hope. Right? And the boasting is not in what we've done, but in what Christ has done for us. And so you see the different roles, the different positions. But in dispensationalism, basically what happens is Jesus is made to work, as it were, for Moses. And that's true in every form of dispensationalism of which I'm aware, even progressive dispensationalism, because it makes national Israel the center of the story of redemptive history. It dislodges Christ from the center, but Jesus himself in John 8 and in Luke 24 says the Bible is about him. Right? And so this is a real difference. And that's why dispensationalism is an inferior version of covenant theology. John MacArthur says that the temple furniture doesn't point to Christ. One of our students was pointing that out to me yesterday. And that's a sharp difference with Reformed theology. We say it certainly does. And by the way, so did Barnabas. Not just Reformed people. The whole great Christian tradition has said all those types and shadows, they all pointed to Christ. Okay, well, what else makes a covenant theology good? Well, it's good theology, right? Covenant theology is Christian theology arranged according to the history of redemption, and we could add in view of eschatology, in view of the inbreaking of the ultimate state, the final state, the consummate state. But it's still theology, and so there's still a doctrine of Scripture, a doctrine of God and man, Christ, salvation, church, last things, and the Christian life. And so if you're, messing that up under the guise of covenant theology, well, then it's not a good covenant theology. It's not like, well, I could teach heresy under the rubric covenant, and then when I'm teaching systematics or catechetical theology, well, then I have to be orthodox. No, they're both supposed to be orthodox. You're supposed to be saying the same thing in different ways. So now, another point to be made here in this episode, and we're clearly going to have another episode to finish answering the question, why covenant theology matters. But another point, and I think the last point for this episode, is to say that Reformed theology is covenant theology. Now, there are other kinds of covenant theologies, as I've tried to illustrate for you, but covenant theology is of the essence of Reformed theology. So to change our covenant theology is to change Reformed theology. And that's why we were so vociferous in the confessional Reformed churches about the federal vision, because they were proposing to take us back to the Remonstrance, right? Back to the very errant and even heretical, according to the Synod of Dort, heretical covenant theology of the Remonstrance of Arminius. And so I don't use the word heretical. I don't drop the H-bomb lightly. I use it because Synod used it, and they used it repeatedly because it's that dangerous. It's that serious. So if the federal vision is making some of the same mistakes, and they are, I think that's been demonstrated. And if you want to know more about that, just go to heidelblog.net and look at the Federal Vision resource page. And it wasn't too long ago that we did an episode sort of going back over the basics of the Federal Vision matter. And recently we published on the Heidel blog, or a little while back, for example, just to give one example, what the Reformed churches have said about Doug Wilson's theology. And we've been very critical. If you haven't seen that, go take a look at that on the Heidel blog. It's easy to find. And you look at the Federal Vision resource page, you can see the report of the PCA, Presbyterian Church in America, their study committee, the report of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, their study committee, the RCUS study committee, Reformed Church in the United States, and the study committee from the United Reformed Churches. And they all agree that federal vision theology is gravely errant and deeply destructive of the biblical covenant theology and the biblical doctrine of salvation, and particularly the biblical doctrine of justification.
Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
So, to try to change Reformed covenant theology is to try to change Reformed theology. But again, I hear people saying, well, I'm a covenant theologian, or I hold covenant theology, Reformed holds covenant theology, therefore I'm Reformed. Well, I've already demonstrated that that's a fallacy. It just doesn't follow. There are lots of covenant theologies. Dispensationalism is a bad covenant theology, but it is a covenant theology. I think I've already shown. And there are at least two Baptist covenant theologies. One that says, well, yeah, there's a kind of continuity. The covenant of grace is present in the types and shadows, but the new covenant is superior because it's the new covenant. It's the inbreaking of heaven and so forth. And so everything that happened before is interesting, but it doesn't exactly continue. Certainly the administration of the covenant of grace is discontinuous. God said, I'll be God to you and to your children. That's expired according to this version. And then there's a more radical Baptist version of covenant theology that says, well, the covenant of grace doesn't even exist in the types and shadows. There are indications, there are allusions, there's anticipation of the covenant of grace, but it doesn't ever actually enter redemptive history until the new covenant. And they're both wrong by the lights of the Reformed churches, but the first one that I described is the one that we used to run into in the sort of banner of truth circles, where you had Baptist and Presbyterian guys working together, Baptist and Reformed people working together, and there was a certain agreement. And I remember having conversations with Baptist friends who seemed anyway to agree with Reformed theology that the Abrahamic covenant is a real administration of the covenant of grace. But now this more radical view, which has real roots in historic, particular Baptist theology from the 17th century, and they're going back to this, and they're saying the covenant of grace doesn't even exist under the types and shadows, and that just has no relationship to Reformed theology at all. It, in my view, very serious error and a very serious denial of a basic historic Christian view that going all the way back to Barnabas, that there's always been one covenant, he said, and we would say of grace, which is really what he's talking about, multiple administrations. So neither one of these Baptist views that I've quickly sketched for you is Reformed, and because every Baptist covenant theology denies this basic tenet of Reformed covenant theology, one covenant of grace, multiple administrations. In Reformed theology, the new covenant is the new administration of the Abrahamic covenant. So it's always in Reformed theology, going back to Zwingli's arguments with the Anabaptists. And you can look at his treatise against the people he called Catabaptists in 1527, and you'll see him making the very same arguments then against the Anabaptists that we make against the Baptists today. That's, by the way, I've been having discussions, and if you've been reading the Heidelblog, which if you're not reading the Heidelblog, what are you doing with your life anyway? You've been writing a series on Daniel Featley's interaction with the Baptists. Not agreeing with everything that Featley says, but I just think it's interesting and illuminating to look at Featley's critique of the Baptists and how he saw them, which is really why I wanted to look at that. How did Featley see them? And he calls them Anabaptists. Now, as I've said many times, if I could get my Baptist friends to listen and hear this, I know what it says at the beginning of the First London Confession, 1644. We are not Anabaptists. I get that. And I understand that's a programmatic thing for you. It's an identity, it's a maxim, an axiom, and it's partly true. But it's obviously, from our point of view, partly not true. So there are ways in which Featley is correct and ways in which he's not. And here's the thing that really drove me to this. When I started looking at Zwingli's critique of the Anabaptists, I saw him making the exact same arguments that I make in response to Baptist questions that I get today. So if there's no way at all in which Baptists are Anabaptists, none at all, which is what my particular Baptist friends tell me, we have no connection with them, no historic connection, no theological connection whatsoever. We're completely hermetically sealed from each other, which is, I don't think that's true. I think if you read the Featley series, I document the actual historical intersections in the Netherlands between the Dutch Mennonites, who are Anabaptists, and Congregationalists who came from England to the Netherlands, who became Anabaptists and then became Baptists, and then brought that theology, piety, and practice back to England. And that's the beginning of the Baptist movement. So that even on a historical, causal level, I just don't think it works. And if you ask Baptist scholars who are not committed, for example, to the First London, but just general Baptist, they will tell you freely, oh, yes, absolutely, we're Anabaptists. And you see that regularly, which is why there's this complicated relationship. So to say that there's no connection whatsoever just doesn't account for historical facts, and it doesn't account for the fact that when I am making arguments against the Baptist view, I am repeating the things that Zwingli said to the Anabaptist. If there's no identity between them theologically, why do the arguments against the Anabaptists, right? Why do they also occur against the Baptists? It just doesn't make any sense. So saying we're not Anabaptists in any way, that's just marketing. That's not history. And I'm trying to do a little history over here. So we've always said in Reformed theology, this is of the essence of Reformed covenant theology, that there is a continuity of the covenant promise made to Abraham in Genesis 17, 7 through 10, and repeated by the Apostle Peter verbatim, the way that it's often expressed in the Hebrew Bible. The promise is to you and to your children. I will be a God to you and to your children. That was the promise. And that's why Peter says the promise. What promise? It's the Abrahamic promise to you and to your children. Now, we might be completely wrong about that. The whole Christian church, through the whole history of the church, may be wrong about that. That's possible. I don't think it is a mistake. I don't think the Baptists have shown, or the Anabaptists have shown, that it is a mistake. But it is certainly, without doubt, right, that is Reformed theology. If you deny that, then you're denying Reformed theology. You're denying Reformed covenant theology. These are two different things. Well, listen, so we'll call this sort of part one of the answer why covenant theology matters. And next time, we will take a look at the history of covenant theology. Now, we've touched on it, but I want to go through it with you in more detail so that you will have some kind of baseline against which to judge of the history of theology and to judge, well, what is a good covenant theology? What has some, basis in the history of covenant theology to be considered a good covenant theology, and what isn't? So, and in that way, you'll also have some background by which you can evaluate Olevianus and see where he fits in the broader history of covenant theology and of Reformed covenant theology.
The story you have just heard was true. Only the names were changed to protect the innocent.
That's it for this episode of the Heidelcast. Join us next time as we continue our series,
The Comfort of the Covenant.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in any podcast app. Email heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Call or text the Heidel phone anytime at 760-618-1563. That's 760-618-1563. Or send a voice memo to heidelcast@heidelblog.net. Remember, the Heidelcast may be cheap, but it isn't free. When the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks.
Copyright 2024. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
Without the creed, what are we? What do we stand for?
All right, that's it. Let's roll. Hey.
Let's be careful out
Good night, Jed.
Nothing is over until we decide it is. Silence! I'm out of here!
We're a little late. Good night, folks.
Well, gracious, say good night.
Good night.
And good night, Mrs. Calabash. Wherever you go.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building.
It's the end of the program. Roy Knapp is at the chimes. Good night, all. We'll be with you tomorrow.
Tune in tomorrow. Same bat time, same bat channel.
Adjusting the Wayback Machine, Sherman and I were quickly on our way.
We're in the Bargain Bramblemobile. We're playing You Made Us Do It. We pulled from the vat, and basically this listener wanted us to go into a restaurant, sit down with somebody who's eating breakfast, and eat off of their plate. Now, we're going to take this one step further. So to clue you in on this, what we're going to do is we're going to go in, find someone eating breakfast alone. We're going to start a conversation with them, a short one. And then when you hear us say, so, you live around here? We are going to start eating off his plate. So you'll know that's when it's going to happen, and we'll see how long it takes for this person to say something. Now, hopefully there's going to be some silverware, but if there's not, we'll just eat like chimps and grab like chunks of eggs with our hands and start going. All right, we're heading down. We're almost there.
Should be a couple blocks more.
About to pull
it's
in.
right there. Good. All right. This is a restaurant open 24 hours. We're told a lot of people stop here to eat their breakfast. Okay, we've never been in this location before.
No, we haven't. First for us.
How's the signal, Reeds?
Anthony's correcting the antenna. We have a little static, but other than that, it's pretty good.
Okay. Look, we know how annoying it can be to be out and listening to us just, crackle and static on you, so we're trying to fix that right now.
Engineer Gary parking on the sidewalk. All right, now we're going to take the antenna out of the car, so we hopefully will remain with decent quality while inside the restaurante.
Okay, now remember, when you hear us say, so you live around here, picture in your mind, we're just eating off his plate. We're not going to talk about eating off his plate. We're just going to do it, and we'll see how long it takes this person. This is a good suggestion. And, Rosemary, we forgot again to give the listener's name that sent in this You Made Us Do It, so if you could find that.
All right, Gary is bringing out the cord, the miniature antenna that'll go inside the restaurant that we're at. We're moving into the door of the restaurant now.
We'll go in, and we'll find someone to eat alone.
All right, Gary's hooking up the antenna. Actually...
All right, see the guy with the cap, that old guy over there looking at us right now?
Right.
He's got to be around 70.
Right. Could be the one.
And it looks like he's got a full plate of food.
Oh, and he's putting his syrup on his pancakes right now.
All right, now he's sitting at the counter, so we'll just go and sit on either side of him.
All right.
You ready?
Gary, are we ready? I'm assuming we are. Okay. We're moving over toward the gentleman we just talked about sitting at the bar, and he's just digging into his breakfast.
Oh, it's pancakes.
The first bite of the day.
Okay. Hello, sir. We're Mark and Brian. How are you?
Fine.
We're broadcasting live right now.
You're on the air with us. Is that okay?
Fine. I should be over there right now.
You should be over there? Yeah. Oh, no. We're just wondering how the pancakes here.
Delicious.
Are they? Are they good?
That's why I ordered them.
Sir, do you eat here every day?
Almost.
Do you live around here?
Yeah, but don't tell my wife.
Uh-huh. Can I have a spoon?
Huh? Don't tell your wife that you don't live around here?
No,
so the pancake...
Thank you.
Huh?
Don't tell her I eat here every day.
Oh, why not?
Only occasionally. These are egg white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just...
All right, so you live around here, huh?
Okay.
Let's try this right here.
Oh, wow.
Not bad.
They are good.
Those are really good.
They're really good. Are the eggs good? Let me try the eggs.
Is there a little more syrup?
Come on, if we put a little butter. No,
He's reaching for the syrup.
You're putting syrup on them.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that.
Not bad.
Can we have a little coffee, please? Man, the cooks are staring at us.
Sip of your coffee, do you mind, sir? Oh, is that tea? That should be good.
Are you okay? I've got 7:30.
Yeah, about 7.
Yeah,
those pancakes are really tasty.
Yeah, pretty good.
Yeah, Brian, did you get some with the syrup on the...
No, I didn't. I need a little syrup.
Here, right here on this side. We put a lot on this side right here.
That's good. These are good.
Do you normally get the eggs running like that?
Eggs are supposed to be basted.
Basted.
You like them like that? They look good.
Those pancakes are great.
I didn't get some of the eggs. Can I get a bite of the eggs?
Yeah.
Here you go. I'm going to get that egg.
That's right there.
Oh, that's good, man.
These pancakes are nice and hot.
Excuse me. I gotta go.
You gotta go?
Yeah.
Are you a little late? Man, that's good.
Gotta go.
Yeah. All right, sir. We gotta tell you something. You're too nice.
You really are.
You allowed us to eat off your plate. We finished your breakfast here. So what we're gonna do? We're just having some fun with you. We're gonna buy your breakfast in here for a whole entire week.
Good.
All right. Well, we got the cash with us here. We'll give it to you. Right here.
Because you eat in here often, right?
Almost every day.
All right, well, here's $40. That should buy your breakfast for an entire week. Is that all right?
Thank you very much.
All right. And that was a fine breakfast. We appreciate you sharing it with us.
You may as well finish it up.
What's that?
You may as well finish it up.
I think I will. It's all right. What's your name?
Joe.
Joe? We're Mark and Brian. We do a radio show here in town. How are you? Nice to shake your hands.
You're a nice man, Joe. Thank you.
I've had your show. I've seen your faces.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Ma'am? Miss? You serve a great breakfast here. Those hot pancakes, the eggs were perfect.
Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for Joe letting us eat it.
All right, Joe, you're a kind man. We're going to go try this again with somebody else.
All right.
Good job, sir.
We'll see you, Joe. Have a good day.
Take that 40.
All right, getting up off our chair.
That guy was just nice.
I'm stopping now.
The best podcast, the Hydrocast.